Obviously, the subject of the day are those jobs numbers out of the United States. Give us your take. 20.5 million Americans have lost their jobs.
Well, it's a very difficult jobs report to look at, David. It's, by the way, good to join you again. Very hard jobs report to look at. As you say, unemployment very high right now. We knew that coming in. And we know the hardship that the Americans reflected in these numbers are experiencing together with their families. So difficult report to look at. Obviously, it's not as in past economics problems we've had, the result of flawed fundamentals underlying the economy. This is the result of the public health measures we've had to take. And that's also the way out as we begin reopening today. But this report, which shows where we stood basically in mid-March, it shows the hardship the American people are experiencing right now.
And it raises a fundamental question that is unanswerable, but you may have a perspective on it, which is how many of these are permanent or long-term loss of jobs, and how many are temporary, whatever that's defined as, 30, 60, 90 days?
Well, David, this is the one time I'll say it's too bad that we can't be on television together as we have these conversations, because there's a chart in the report we put out today that addresses that question, showing that nearly 90% of the unemployed have said that they're on temporary layoff. And what this chart reflects is that in past economic slowdowns, permanent layoffs were going way up, whereas this time it's really temporary layoffs that are through the roof. That, to me, was the single most important piece of data in this report. But let me hasten to add, it's no guarantee that these are temporary layoffs. The job before us now is to make them so. It's to be able to safely reopen our economy, reopen our businesses safely, so we can fulfill the expectation of these workers that they will be able to go back to their jobs.
Yeah, and I'll do my best at some risk of describing the chart because I have it in front of me, going back to 2006, and it has a black line that spikes up. This is non-temporary. This is long-term layoffs. It spiked up in 2009. It has come down gradually, and then a slight tick up right with this within the last few months. At the same time, a red line, which is temporary, which has just spiked up in the last 30, 60 days dramatically. That's what the chart shows. But that is the question. How do we know they're temporary, Mr. Secretary?
Good description of the chart. And by the way, back there in 2008, 2009, about 70% of workers, when surveyed, said that they were on permanent layoff, whereas now that number really quite low, and we're at about close to 90 saying it's temporary. But to your question, this situation is so fluid right now. This survey reflects questions asked and data gathered in mid-April. We know that so much has changed since then. There have been more layoffs. We know that. But then people are starting to go back. It's really an unknown, David, what the extent to which we'll succeed in getting people back so that these are, in fact, a temporary impact. But we know the path forward. We know that we need to continue these safety measures that we've been engaged in, but that we can now, and states are, begin reopening. 30 states now are in the process of reopening. We want to do that safely and bring people back to work.
So the Congress with the President have joined together with a massive, I think it's fair to use that word, spending program, including the so-called PPP, Payroll Protection Plan, but other investment as well. I mean, we're talking $3 trillion, plus we have the Fed ponying up another maybe $4 trillion, something like that. Are you seeing anything in the data indicating that might be ameliorating the loss of jobs yet?
Well, we're confident it is, because the Paycheck Protection Program, for example, which provided loans to small businesses that were forgivable so long as those workers were kept on payroll. We know that reached nearly 4 million small businesses and tens of millions of workers. We don't know exactly where those workers fall in the data we reported today due to just kind of peculiarities in the questions that are asked. But we are confident that there's been relief provided that way. And, of course, we know that because of the bill the President signed and got through Congress so quickly, that for those who don't have the benefit of that program, who are unemployed, there's this additional $600 weekly benefit on top of the ordinary state unemployment benefits.
How reliable are the data? I mean, everything's moving so dramatically right now, but there are reports, for example, that your household survey actually was 13 points lower in the response rate, and also maybe some miscoding of people misidentifying whether, in fact, they are laid off or not laid off.
Well, we were pleased with the response rates we had, actually, David. So I think the integrity of the survey is strong. We do not have that concern. However, as I said, things are so fluid right now. People have to appreciate that. Are a lot of Americans out of work right now? Absolutely. It's one of the two greatest challenges facing the country. The other being the virus itself. So we know that. The exact number, very, very hard to pin down, in part because there's some people still leaving work right now, but across the country, people starting to go back. So whether the 14.7 unemployment rate is the exact rate or whether it's closer to 20, which you could see by looking at the data differently, not sure. We know it's much too high, and we know that we have the capacity to keep it temporary and get people back to work.
Mr. Secretary, your responsibilities go well beyond just calculating the numbers for unemployment. One of them is actually the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Let's talk about OSHA and what role it could play in getting people back to work. I mean, there are people, we just talked to Richard Trumka for AFL-CIO, who's favoring an emergency workplace infectious disease standard. Whether it's that or something else, are you working actively on some standard that will say to employers and employees it's safe to come back to work under these circumstances?
OSHA has been putting information out about COVID-19 actually since January and proceeding really very vigorously on two different tracks, David. First, we've put out extensive guidance to employers, to workers about the measures to take in the workplace to stay safe. And that includes industry-specific guidance for construction, meatpacking, curbside pickup, other industries, and more to come. And so we're putting out, and we're doing it in cooperation often with CDC, a great deal of information to help keep workplaces safe. And then we also do have enforcement tools available. And with all respect to President Trump, I think there are aspects of what we are doing now and are able to do, if necessary, to bring enforcement measures. I think there are aspects of that he doesn't fully understand. So there is intense focus on the part of OSHA and frankly, on my part personally, to protect workers and to make those workplaces safe workplaces that everybody can come back to.
Final question on this. What about meatpacking plants? Are they sort of exempted from OSHA now because they're under the Defense Production Act?
Not at all. It's really to the contrary, David. As you say, the president used his emergency powers a couple of weeks ago to make sure that the supply of meat continued, that critical food is available to Americans. However, we put out joint guidelines with CDC, and these meatpacking companies that are under presidential supervision are going to need to follow those guidelines.